next to a coffee. What happens to the water? What happens to the pigment? How do those things react? So the first one is add a tea wash up against a cream wash of a different color. Okay, so I've got my paintbrush and a tea wash. So a tea wash is really nice and thin. And you probably already have that on your palettes, right? So you're going to go back to a lot of water, very little pigment. And I'm going to put a wash down here. And I'm going to try and keep it nice and wet. I don't necessarily want a puddle here, but I want it nice and wet. Because now I want a cream, which is a lot of pigment and not a lot of water. It still flows, but it's not really going anywhere like the tea. It kind of stays where it is, right? And so now I've got my brush loaded with enough. This is where you have to be generous with your paints, so make sure that you can see it on your palette, okay? So I'm going to put, oh, and it should be a different color. Don't do what I'm doing. Okay. So now I'm going to put a cream wash, and I think I can get darker, and I might as well because I wanted a different color anyway. So I'm going to add a little more pigment to that. And this is my cream right next to my tea wash. Okay? And so that's that. And so we're going to be looking. Watercolor is a game of patience very often. Like, I wouldn't use my heat gun to hurry this up because I did this because I want these two things to interact. Not only do I maybe want the colors to interact, but I want some of this pigment and some of the water to carry some of this pigment here. I want this edge that I'm going to get. And you don't really know what the edge is until it dries, right? So these are all things that you're going to know, and you're going to be able to predict and understand this happens when I do this. And this is just, this kind of experimenting will just kind of help you with that. So add a tea wash up against a coffee wash of a different color. We'll do that. So we've got 10 of these. What happens when you add a cream wash, which I already have, into a puddle? Okay, so I'm going to get a puddle. And a puddle, how do I know it's a puddle, right? I have to, first of all, get it wet, so it's going to be a wet on wet kind of thing. And then I have to look. A puddle is shiny. A puddle is that water, that there's so much water on the paper that it actually sits on top of the paper. Okay? So before it was just wet. But now I got me a puddle. Okay? And I'm going to get the cream again. It can be any color you want. See how wet it is? But it's not going to really move anywhere. And what is it? What happens when you add a cream wash into a puddle? So there I go.
Wow.
Okay. And now,
cool. That's really pretty.
It is. It's beautiful,
is that
right?
The blue, or is it?
This is, I think, phthalo blue
and blue.
Oh,
blue?
Yes.
Yeah.
What's happening, yes, I'm getting a bloom just within water, so the edges are actually against the white of the paper, which is really pretty. But, so as you're doing this and you're experimenting, try not to move it, I don't want to, we're going to see kind of what happens. Eventually, this whole thing is going to be dry, and the event here is going to be done, right? So then it says, what happens when you want to create a bloom? So I want you to create a bloom. I'm not going to tell you that because I know many of you have made blooms already, oftentimes by accident, right? So one of these boxes is going to be actually an on-purpose kind of bloom. And then the very last one, the ninth one, the eighth one, sorry. So one makes you make a bloom. The other one is for those moments where you're like, shoot, you got to bloom and you don't want to bloom. What do you do? Mm-hmm. So one of them so for two of them you actually have to make a bloom. One you're going to leave. The other one you're going to try to fix and get rid of the bloom.
Can you show how to purposely make a bloom? Because I don't know how I
do milk, right? The consistency of milk would be a nice thing. So I am going to mine. So I'll do a bloom down here. So I've got the consistency of milk here, which means that there's plenty of water and there's a nice amount of pigment and it's wet, right? And so now I am going to, there's multiple ways to do a bloom. I can do a bloom by putting some, by putting some tea into it. I'm going to let it sit for a little bit. I want to let it sit in the paper a little bit.
So you're making the green into a tea.
The green, the green is a tea, which means that it has a lot of water in it, right? If I put butter into here or cream into here, it's so heavy with pigment, it's not really going to flow. So oftentimes when you're creating a bloom, you are putting in paint or water mixture that has more water than what is in there. All right, so it's kind of, it's still really wet, but I'm gonna drop that in there. And I just drop it in the middle. And so what's happening now is that there's so much more water here and everything around it is kind of wet. So the water is just going to flow and go with the other water and play, right? And it's going to carry some of the pigment with it. And with the flowing of it, it's going to push the other pigment around it away from where it had settled in a nice, consistent wash. Okay, so I've got that. I can also get a bloom with just straight water. I'll get a bloom up here. So this is really wet up here yet. Mm-hmm. It's much more dry down here. And now I'm going to oh my gosh, when you're painting, right, and you're, even when you're almost done and it's fabulous and you just put something down and you take your paintbrush around and it drips, it oh my God.
Whoa.
So that can happen. That is heartbreaking when something like that happens. So that's another bloom, right? Blooms are most effective when there's a lot of water coming from your brush or pigment into a damp surface, okay? When it's equal amounts of water, which this might have even been more equal than I wanted. When it's equal amounts of water, you don't get a bloom, but you can get some really nice color mixing. I mean, the water and the pigment pushed the purple. It didn't just set on top of it, it pushed it. But I'm not getting the lines because the level of water was way too consistent. The level of water here was totally imbalanced. So, all right. You guys have any other questions? I'm going to be going around.